President Trump has recently said that we're at war against radical Islamic terrorism. 15 years ago, President George W. Bush declared a global war on terrorism. Decades before that, President Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs. I would argue that these are all only parts of the puzzle, and that the war we're in right now is bigger than the individual parts. This is a war for, not against, but for the future of the progressive, rule-based world order.
I think what we're seeing in a lot of parts of the developing world is this increasingly corrupted, criminalized state.
We haven't seen anything like our present day, the way ISIS is using women.
The impunity has been deeply embedded into a culture at all levels. It's a way of life.
You have state actors and you have non-state actors.
Where immorality and criminality have wormed their way into society to such an extent that the function of rule of law no longer moves as it should.
What appeared to be a network of independent shipping companies, port authorities, and maritime service providers turned out to actually be a very hierarchical power structure that was operating with official Russian government sanction.
When illicit power structures and their interests are not accounted for in peace agreements or other negotiated settlements, it is nearly impossible to control them, let alone make them go away.
I think we have to fundamentally understand that there is a group of countries, well-financed, well-resourced, and tied to people who want to see the destruction of the United States among the multiple other countries that are there. And if we don't take them seriously, as we have, I think, failed to do in the last 10 or 15 years, they will advance along their own agenda more quickly than we think possible.
You know, we've made mistakes, I think, in sort of assuming that we're dealing with neutral state institutions and leaders, for example, and it helped create a humanitarian crisis of colossal scale.
When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, its collapse did indeed signal the death of communism and its underlying ideology, but it did not guarantee the permanence or the long-term survival of the progressive, liberal, rule-based world order. Instead, the collapse of communist and Soviet-supported regimes around the world unleashed a global tide of centrifugal, non-state forces that have been challenging governments and governance primarily in the developing countries ever since. In his 1998 book, McMafia, Misha Glenny explained that this is the result of a combination of the post-communist chaos and the deregulation of both capital flows and human trafficking. Criminal networks trafficking drugs, weapons, humans, and anything else they could profit from subverted stabilization efforts in the Balkans. Powerful drug cartels wreaked havoc on Latin America. The Revolutionary United Front and other illicit networks, using profits from blood diamonds and other contraband, tormented Sierra Leone and West Africa throughout the 1990s. Also, during the 1990s, peace operations worldwide were repeatedly subverted and compromised by spoilers, which Professor Steven Stedman was among the first to examine carefully. In his seminal 1997 article, Spoiler Problems in Peace Processes, Stedman proposed a simple typology consisting of limited, absolute, and greedy spoilers, distinguishable by their goals and motives, and suggested strategies for countering them. During the Clinton administration, in response, U.S. policymakers and strategists developed concepts for dealing with spoilers. But the George W. Bush administration both discredited the concept of peace operations as international social work, in the words of Michael Mandelbaum, and dismantled much of the effort of its predecessors. It was only with the al-Qaeda attacks of 9/11/2001 that the Bush administration began taking the threat from networked non-state adversaries seriously. Then, as the experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan began to unravel in 2004 and 2005, Washington began receiving persistent queries from the field concerning the nature of the unexpected non-state adversaries that soldiers, diplomats, and development officials were encountering. My colleagues at the State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development struggled to understand the motives, the worldviews, the structures, and the rules under which these disruptive networked adversaries were operating. Meanwhile, the Department of Defense was receiving warfighter challenges from fighters in the field who were trained to defeat enemy military forces, but had difficulty operating successfully against non-state adversary networks that blended into the human terrain. The interagency work, begun around 2005 to achieve a better understanding of this emerging threat environment, included a collection of accounts from practitioners, policymakers, and scholars of efforts to counter the exercise of illicit power around the world. Some of their accounts coalesced into the book Impunity, Countering Illicit Power in War and Transition. Finding the right terminology in evolving areas is always a challenge in the social sciences, and the interagency working groups debated over the uses of such terms as illicit, illegal, and informal to describe the adversary networks encountered. Whether illicit, illegal, or informal, what these networks have in common is that they defy the rule-based liberal order that currently governs the behavior of states in the global system. They operate outside of the rules. They seek exemption, they seek impunity, they seek license for their actions, and as such, they subvert and weaken the system. The small interagency team working on what was then called the Illicit Power Structures Project in 2005 through 2009 built on Professor Stedman's typology, factoring in such other attributes as mode of operation and organizational structure, whether it was hierarchical, string network, hub network. As the country case studies began to proliferate and strategic approaches to countering illicit networks were applied, these revealed a profound gap in our understanding of the global threat environment. The book Impunity and its sisters, Convergence and Beyond Convergence, are small steps towards addressing that gap. Few people recognize how grave the threat posed by illicit network convergence is, even within the national and international security communities. Of course, we hear constantly the litany of terrorist attacks, but most people continue to experience the threat in an abstract and indirect way. If people could understand the purchasing power of these networks, they might conclude that they don't represent a law enforcement problem, but rather constitute a clear and present danger not only to the United States and the American people, but to the Westphalian order itself. Estimates of the magnitude of the global illicit economy range from 1 to 20% of global product. Back in 1998, then IMF Managing Director Michel de Camdessous estimated that the amount of laundered money in the world represented between 2 and 5% of global GDP, what he called an amount almost beyond imagination. 10 years later, in McMafia, Glenny estimated that illegal trade accounts for 1/5 of the global GDP. Why do these estimates vary so much? Because they're extrapolations from very limited samples provided by arrests, confiscations, seizures, court records, journalists' reports, etc., none of which come anywhere near close to comprehensiveness. But regardless of the estimate, we're talking about trillions of dollars, 1 to 20 trillion in fact. At the high end of that range, $20 trillion, we're approaching the size of the United States economy. Imagine the firepower that kind of money can buy. Not to mention enabling terrorist and transnational criminal organizations to hire the most expensive lawyers, accountants, IT technicians, and hired guns. Add to this the rogue countries, what Moises Naim calls mafia states and Douglas Farah calls criminalized states, that collude with terrorists and transnational criminals by using the traditional tools of statecraft, such as passports, visas, diplomatic pouch privileges, aircraft and ship registries. These countries, like Venezuela, the Islamic Republic, North Korea, Guinea-Bissau, and allegedly Russia. Throughout the 1990s, Charles Taylor turned Liberia into a nation-scale criminal enterprise. What this all amounts to is a full-on assault on the global, rule-based, liberal system of states and the emergence of a parasitic alternative global political economy, possibly as large as 1/5 the size of the licit global economy. And although not by any means monolithic, it coheres in its commitment to weakening governments and governance worldwide. And remember, this is on top of a proliferation of fragile, failing, or failed states reaching nearly pandemic proportions. The Fund for Peace, a nonprofit organization, publishes an annual Fragile States Index, according to which no less than 107 of the 178 countries reported on are labeled in the elevated warning category. Each one of these vulnerable states is a veritable petri dish for illicit networks. Some have called them ungoverned spaces, and while I don't favor that term, it's from these weak states that many of the most pernicious illicit networks have originated, or have served as planning and training bases or staging grounds, including Afghanistan, which was the home of al-Qaeda prior to the 9/11 attacks. We don't have the luxury of waiting for the discovery of silver bullet solutions or strategies to counter illicit networks and illicit power. We have to respond with imperfect understanding and incomplete knowledge of highly complex environments. But we have to constantly seek to improve our understanding of these environments, because context is key. Analysis and the strategies derived from it will be and should be context-specific. No two illicit power structures are identical, and a misdiagnosis of the problem can be as counterproductive as it is in medicine. Now, I have no doubt that we have the analytic talent and we have the resources to meet the illicit power challenge. It would appear, though, that we lack the leadership and the necessary commitment, the political will. There's an unwillingness to accept that complex and long-term challenges require long-term commitment, and that some of these challenges can't be defeated but merely mitigated. In recent years, international terrorist networks, transnational criminal organizations, and globally networked insurgencies have been interacting at an unprecedented rate. And whether those interactions should be characterized as coordination, collaboration, or collusion, we can't say with certainty, as the available evidence is slim. But regardless of the ultimate intent behind such interactions, the net result is increased operational effectiveness of our adversaries and increased potential harm to the United States and the American people. This is the challenge, persuading policymakers, practitioners, and scholars that not all existential threats take the shape of mushroom clouds or airliners crashing into the New York City skyline. But it must be more than just rhetoric. The challenge is training and educating ourselves to perceive the global threat environment in its full complexity and ensure that we are never again found guilty of a failure of imagination, as the 9/11 Commission report warned. A recent study of the problem of incorporating cutting-edge social science research into joint professional military education, as well as into national defense and security policy debates, showed that too often the research is packaged in ways that are user-unfriendly, don't lend themselves to easy adaptation to the adult learning environment. Over the past 5 years, the Center for Complex Operations at National Defense University has been developing an approach to the subject matter that is easy for instructors to adapt to their classrooms and for trainers to adapt to their units. That's what this project is about. We have to be able to anticipate unprecedented future threats to national and international security and to develop the resilience to counter those threats. Just as cancer is an existential threat to a person as a bullet, even slower in its lethality, the proliferation of illicit networks and their impunity pose an existential threat to our rule-based global system of states and the order on which that system is based.